a story that we're hearing again and again. We heard rumors of it, at least we had one report of it prior to the summit, actually following Witkoff's visit to Moscow a couple of weeks ago. And then since the summit, we've heard it actually from many different sources, from Reuters, the New York Times, from Axios, and then directly from Witkoff himself. And what is this that we've heard? An acceptance on the part of the Americans, or of Russia's claim to the territory of Donbass, which is to say Lugansk and Donetsk. This would require the Ukrainians to withdraw from Donetsk, of which they currently control about 30%. The Russians have 70% of that, and they have close to 100% of Lugansk, so that's not such a big issue. But they would have to, withdraw from the field or, the line of trees or something that they still hold within Lugansk. And then in exchange for that, this is this swap that Trump was mentioning. The Russians would withdraw from the territory they've seized in Sumy and also in the Kharkov region, which is, fairly significant, but I guess it's less than, I don't know exactly how it adds up, but we're maybe talking about less acreage than what the Ukrainians would have to give up in Donetsk. And more importantly, when we're talking about Donetsk, we're talking about major cities that they would have to surrender. There's Pokrovsk, which is under siege, and there's Konstantinovka, which is basically under siege as well. There's Seversk, which will soon be under siege. But then there are those cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are two very important cities. And, they're good-sized cities, and they're also symbolically important. Slavyansk is the city where the whole thing began. I mean, the rebellion, basically, against the new Push regime, the regime that took power after the 2014 coup. That's where it all began. I guess it was Strelkov that, led a rebellion there. And that's what, led to the Civil War. So it would be symbolically important, but it would also be militarily. This is very important territory. This is territory that's, again, the Donetsk is probably is a very important oblast within Ukraine, or territory of the former Ukraine for a number of reasons. One is that it's really the industrial heartland of Ukraine, with many factories, but also mines, a lot of mineral wealth, and a denser population. And then also, from the point of view, a military point of view, this is where they built up their defenses. It's really their main line of defense that's been, where they fought the hardest, where they're best able to defend against the Russian advances. The other provinces are not nearly so easy to defend. So this would be a major sacrifice on the part of the Ukrainians. But then remember, of course, that what the Russians have been saying again and again, there's the four oblasts that belong to them. It's not just Donetsk and Lugansk, but also Zaporozhye and Kherson. And they insisted that these, according to their constitution now that the referenda were held in these oblasts, these are part of Russia and basically non-negotiable. Now, we don't know exactly what was said, but it's kind of sounding like that Putin made a concession on these, or at least appeared to. That what these reports say is that he appeared to freeze the line, agreed to freeze the lines of contact. Just to stop the advances in Zaporozhye. Now, there haven't been any advances in Kherson because that would entail a crossing of the river, but it looks like they were perhaps preparing for a river crossing to seize at least part of the city of Kherson, and that would stop, of course. Now, this is, it's difficult. Again, the Russians themselves have not acknowledged this, so maybe these rumors are untrue. It just you wonder because they've been they've been reappearing in different sources, and Witkoff himself, reported the same thing in an interview that was done by CNN recently, I think yesterday. Now, the Russians have not reported this themselves. There's no, statement from the Russian government to that effect. But at the same time, they're not denying it. Now, you just have to wonder, did Putin really agree to this? How could he do this? Again, after, this is the big question. It does seem like there's something afoot there. Maybe there's something that we're not hearing. I have to wonder.
Well, at the end of the day, does it really matter? Because if the Ukrainians reject this, which they will, I believe Zelensky's already said he's rejecting this,
right,
then that means the war continues and they will continue to take the land in that area. This is something that we talked about earlier. It's like perhaps the way out of this is that there's no solution that we presented that will make everybody happy. Just get something that, looks presentable, like this deal here, that it's something that is palatable to, the people in the West. I mean, I think the average person that's listening to it says, yeah, that sounds fair. That deal sounds okay. We can end the killing. So we'll agree we'll present this deal and we'll know that Zelensky will reject it. And so that's part of the plan. We know that doesn't matter what we do, but we have to present something that's packageable, that's nice, that seems fair to the world. And then when the Ukrainians and the Europeans say no, then Trump can walk away. Do you think that's what's going on?
That may very well be what's going on. That Putin made this offer, made this apparent concession, knowing that it was not going to be accepted. It's a little bit of a gamble, because if it was accepted, then how is he going to explain this? But I think he was just absolutely certain that it would be rejected. And Zelensky has already rejected that outright, right? So, yeah, that may be what it's all about. It's just like, okay, they were getting... they would constantly be told by the Americans, you need to make some concessions, concessions on both sides. And by doing this, by making this concession, but a concession that he doesn't actually have to implement, he's brought the Americans around. And the Americans now agree with his basic, position. Again, no ceasefire before a general agreement. And he's shown his willingness to bargain. A willingness to make a concession. And then, Zelensky and the Europeans are doing whatever they can to sabotage it. I think quite foolishly. You look at it from Zelensky's point of view, actually, the Ukrainians, this is a great deal. This is a lot better than you really could have hoped for. You should have just jumped on it right now and actually kind of called Putin's bluff, right? I think that would be the smart thing to do. And all you do is you lose 30% of Donetsk, which you were going to lose anyway. Let's be honest, right? Maybe it would be a few more months, at 6 months or whatever, but you're going to lose the rest of Donetsk. So why not just use that 30% that's remaining as a bargaining chip for just stopping the war and actually as stopping the advances in these other oblasts? And you were going to lose, prior to this deal, you're going to lose all four of them. And the potential, of course, that it was going to go on. And you would also lose Kharkov and Sumy and, of course, Nikolaev and Odessa. So the smart thing to do would just say, okay, yeah, call Putin's bluff. But I think he's incapable of doing, and Putin knows he's incapable of doing. So maybe that's that's the only thing that makes sense to me. The only explanation for this apparent concession, which, seemed to go against everything, which does go against really not everything, but it is something the Russians said they couldn't do, and they said it again and again. Again, this is Russian territory. We're never going to give it up. Now they say we can give up parts of these territories of Kherson and Zaporozhye. So that is a huge concession. They're saying, okay, went to the Americans, look, this is a huge concession. This is going to be hard. A lot of people in Russia are going to be unhappy about this, but we're doing this. And now the Americans can go to the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and say, hey, look, they're making this. You guys have to accept this. This is a deal that can work, but they won't. And then afterwards, the Russians can say, hey, Yeah, we tried, and and also the Americans. If Trump really wants to get out of this, and I think he does. Um, and there are people in his administration that are with him on this. Either China hawks or for whatever reason they just don't see the point of continuing this war. This really does give him an out. Now, like all the things I've said earlier, it's still going to be tough, but it does give him an opportunity. There's a chance that he could pull it off. I'm not sure that he can really walk away from it, but there is a door is opening that that he could potentially, push further open and just leave.
If Zelensky takes this deal, would his life be in danger? Is this the reason he doesn't want that? We feel confident that he will reject any deal, is that he needs the war to stay in power. It's kind of a similar situation with Netanyahu. He needs to keep the war going or it's all going to fall apart for him. Is that the same situation?
Well, right. I think it is. There's no question about it. Let's say even if he did want to take the deal, he might not be able to. You're right. Again, like you say, there are a lot of violent people in Ukraine who would just find this completely unacceptable and would eliminate Zelensky. I think that there's every reason to fear that or to expect that. But I'm not at all certain. I think probably, from everything he said over the last few years, he's become kind of a true believer himself. He has internalized the Banderite way of looking at things. It's just like, again, it's better for all of Ukraine to just go down in flames than for us ever to bend the knee to the Russians, in whatever way, to actually retreat. You've seen how he's fought every one of these battles. He never retreats. Even when it makes military sense, even when there's generals like Zelensky say, we really just have to pull out to save our men and equipment and fight another day. He always tells them to fight until it's really too late. And then, the brigade or whatever that's defending the town, let's say, whatever it is largely destroyed. And so I don't see any indication that he really that he is capable of actually, withdrawing from any territory. If he can't withdraw from a single town like Uladar, is he going to actually withdraw from the rest of Donetsk? And I think that's what Putin and his people are probably looking at that and saying, yeah, he's not going to do it. So this is a cost-free concession for us. Let's make it and then, prove our good intentions, and then when he rejects it, we can move on. And we proved our good intentions both to the Americans. We'll see what they do with it. Again, it's just with Trump, it's always unpredictable, but clearly he is trying to go with it now. I think there's no question about it. But we've also shown our good intentions to the rest of the world, to our allies and friends around the world.
Right. So you think that there's basically no chance then that this Zelensky will accept this deal? So he will reject it almost certainly.
Almost certainly.
So then the war is just going to continue? Are we going to see a withdrawal of American support when there's a rejection of this plan? I mean, that's clearly the way it should go, right? Say, okay, here's the plan. We can get peace. Let's do it now. It's a great deal for Ukraine. You're going to get all this territory that you lost in Sumy and around Kharkov, and you're not going to lose all of Kherson or Zaporozhye. The Russians are going to be furious. Putin's going to have a field day on his hand if you accept this. You want to make Putin get unpopular and get ousted? Take the deal. That's going to piss everybody off in Russia, but he's not going to do it. So then the logical response for the Americans is to be like, okay, then we're not going to continue funding this war because you're not accepting the deal that we negotiated. That's actually a great deal. This is the best thing you're going to get. Then what? First of all, do you think that's what we'll do? We'll actually withdraw? And then what is Zelensky going to do?
Right. Well, I think we'll see a continuation of what we've seen already. And, actually, the Americans have already been pulling away. Again, we had that statement, like, what was it, 6 weeks or 2 months ago that, hey, we're running out of these things. No more of these particular weapon systems. And and then it was sort of like they fudged it, and after there's a great outcry, they kind of implied, well, we'll try to find some more Patriot interceptors or whatever. But it became, they say, yeah, well, we've got this arrangement with the Germans, but then they went and asked the Germans, said, well, we don't have any of these. I don't know what he's talking about. So I think the fact is, like on certain weapon systems, there's really nothing that we can supply. It doesn't matter if you're Joe Biden or Donald Trump or anybody, and whether you want to support or the Ukrainians or not. They just, some weapon systems have been so depleted, some munitions have been so depleted that there's really nothing that the Americans should do, regardless of intentions. Now, for other things, there are obviously weapons and ammunition that we can continue to supply to the Ukrainians. But Donald Trump says he wants to do it. He wants the Europeans to pay for it. And I think the Europeans, a few of the countries got together and they've already agreed to buy $1.5 billion worth of U.S. military equipment for the Ukrainians. Now, with these things, you hear these deals. Okay, that's actually not much when you look at the well over 100 billion, or that's been spent. It's probably well over 200 billion at this point that's been spent on the war so far. But even so, when are these weapons actually going to arrive? Are they even actually available now? Are they in stock, or do they need to be produced? There are real constraints. And it was bad, even if under Joe Biden's system, they were really coming to the end, and that flow of weapons was diminishing from month to month. And again, not because the Biden administration didn't want to supply them, but the fact is that the Americans were running out. And that's not a problem that's going to go away. Now, with Trump's new system, you say, okay, yeah, we will continue to supply weapons, but the Europeans have to buy them. That just kind of throws creates new obstacles. It's not like it's undoable, but it's like I think I mentioned earlier, there are collective action problems. There's no real, solid, reliable mechanism for these purchases. You guys just have to depend on the willingness of different countries. And I think that, as we've seen in the case of Europe, that's going to break down over time. So it just looks actually very bleak for the Ukrainians. Now, when the line really collapses, and I think it will at some point, and let's say, and there's just really significant advances on the part of the Russians, much more significant, much more rapid than we've seen so far, then there's going to be such a hue and cry that there will be a tremendous amount of pressure on the U.S. administration, on the Trump administration. And there will be a lot of finger pointing. They'll say, look, you're losing Ukraine. It was because of you, even though it really might not have been because of, it really didn't matter so much, because in the end, because there are these physical constraints, there's limits to what the U.S. can supply. But that the finger will be pointed at Trump, and they'll say that it's because of what you did. This you stabbed the Ukrainians in the back. You didn't. It used to be as long as it takes, but you gave up on them. You left them stranded, and now you've got an Afghanistan on your hands. And it's going to be really hard for Trump to. Not to do something, that's something that we've talked about, and we just don't know. We'll see, we'll see. But I guess the best thing, of course, is, I think for Ukraine and for everybody, is that if Trump just sticks to his guns and said, no, this is your problem. We had a deal. You guys sabotaged the deal. You refused to take it. Don't come screaming to me. We'll see if he can hold the line. That would be great if he does. I'm not sure that he can. That he will be able to when the time comes.
And what are the Europeans? How are they behaving? European leaders? They're clearly very upset. Is there anything that you think that they can try to do to sabotage or I mean, the
Well,
thing is, they can't do. That's the problem. Zelensky,
yeah,
nobody can do anything. I mean, it's amazing
right.
for, the Russians. They don't have to make any concessions. They're in the driver's seat. This is why Putin making these concessions to not take all these Kherson and Zaporozhye is such a great deal for them. You think that they would recognize that?
Yeah, no, yeah, obviously they don't. They're deluded and well, you're asking what they're doing. Well, they're basically all the leaders, presidents of the most important countries are in Washington, D.C. right now, getting ready to meet with Trump, I think in just like a couple of hours from now. Um, and
But what do they
why I
want Trump
think
to do?
they, I think they simply want him make sure that he goes back to, returns to his previous position, which was in line with the Europeans, ceasefire first. And of course, the idea of a ceasefire first is just really a chance for to give the Ukrainians, who are falling apart right now, to put things back together, to get a breather, to rearm. That's the hope. Um, and then, uh, but not to make any kind of concessions, basically, when it comes down to it. It's just, they, I know it's absurd because it's completely unrealistic. But that's been their position all along, and they are clearly, they're again talking about sending peacekeepers or what they call reassurance troops or something, some nonsense like that. Um, and that promise to send the peacekeepers actually is that promise itself sabotages any kind of peace agreement because the Russians are not going to stand for that. That's basically what they wanted. They've been trying to prevent all along. So this promise that the instant there's a ceasefire, we'll send Russian, French troops or British troops. Those are two countries that have promised to do that. That would be immediately would derail any kind of agreement. So that's their purpose is to derail any kind of agreement, which just seems really nutty. They've actually got the weaker hand. So what are they trying to do? They just don't seem to understand that they have the weaker hand, or they just can't believe that they have the weaker hand. They just believe that somehow, we are the West. America is America. We can't possibly lose this war. So don't give up. We have to fight to the end because we're just bound to win because we're the West.
How have the summit and all this talk about a potential peace deal, is it affecting movements on the ground? Are we seeing an acceleration for Russia, or is it business as usual? Or are they kind of holding off until we get a clear message from the Europeans and
Yeah.
Zelensky or Trump about this plan?
Well, I don't think we're seeing any change on it hasn't had any impact whatsoever on the battlefronts. Um, Now, what's happening. Of course, there's that big breakthrough to the north of Pokrovsk. The Russians just broke through, went 10, 11 kilometers in a day. The the Ukrainians really panicked, and what I've heard, they've sent at least a half a dozen brigades to to counterattack at the salient, established by the Russians, and they managed to push the Russians back a bit, at the tip of the salient, which is not surprising. I mean, but as other analysts have pointed out, this is actually not a demonstration of Ukrainian weakness. If you got to send like a half a dozen brigades to it, your best brigades, actually, we're talking about the most experienced there, um, and best armed units and pull them off of other critical points on the front line, like right there at Konstantinovka. That shows actually how weak your position is. So what we've seen is that, okay, things have slowed down right there in Pokrovsk because the Ukrainians are throwing everything into it, but they've actually sped up in other places like Seversk and Konstantinovka. Because again, those brigades were pulled away from those lines, and now the Russians are advancing. So I don't think it's had any impact on the front line. I think there has been maybe there was an impact, or has been an impact on the air war. That it seems to me the Russians have slowed down, their nightly attacks, the missile and drone attacks over the last week or so. We haven't seen as many. And that may be just sort of a nod to the Americans, a temporary slowdown, just to try to avoid any incidents that could be used to kind of to derail the a potential agreement. Now, and then on the other hand, the Ukrainians have been, over this last week or two, have been actually intensifying their attacks, their drone attacks on especially neighboring regions, places like Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk, kind of their targets almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely civilian. And they have killed quite a few civilians in those regions over the last week or two. It's a daily thing. And I think it's just like from their perspective, this is what you always see whenever there's some sort of negotiations, a potential of some sort of agreement between the U.S. And the Russians. They always seem to intensify these attacks on civilians. And I suppose if they're looking for a logic, the idea is that they're trying to provoke the Russians into overreacting in a way that would derail the talks. That seems foolish, but maybe there's that logic, or it's just maybe just anger. It's just like a lot of what the Ukrainians do, especially their attacks on civilians. I don't think there really is a rationality behind it. It's just this nihilistic hatred. But we do seem to be seeing that, again, in the last 2 weeks or so.